May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. I remember the bells first, their echoes carried across cities that had survived. In London, flags rippled in the wind, and in Paris, people poured into the boulevards, singing, weeping, kissing strangers as though the world had finally turned merciful. Even in New York, horns blared and paper confetti rained down from skyscrapers. That was how freedom sounded on one side of the ocean. But where I stood, it was different. There were no parades, no champagne, only the dry rattle of boots on gravel and the wind tugging at barbed wire fences. We were gathered in rows, the women pressed close, some no older than me, some carrying the lines of exhaustion far deeper. An American officer cleared his throat, his voice steady, as if reading from a script. "You can go home," he said. The words should have fallen like a blessing the moment we had prayed for through months of captivity. Yet what followed was silence heavy and strange. I felt my stomach twist not with joy but with something closer to dread. I lowered my eyes, afraid to meet the gaze of the others. A few shook their heads, faintly whispering in German, "No, not yet, not there." I could not understand myself. Shouldn't freedom taste sweet? Shouldn't the gates flung open mean salvation? And yet in that instant I thought of the letters of Hamburg, starving of Dresden and ashes of families vanished into nothing. The officer's words lingered in the air, but inside me they carried no promise, only the sharp weight of fear. Home was no longer home, and that truth was harder to bear than the fences around me. The officer's words still hung in the air, sharp as the clang of a bell, but no one moved. "You can go home." I repeated them in my head slowly, as though turning them over might reveal another meaning, something kinder than what they carried. Around me the women stood, stiff shoulders drawn, close eyes cast downward. I had expected cries, the kind that rose from the chest and broke open the silence. Instead, there was only a murmur, faint and broken like wind sneaking through cracks in the barracks wall. One woman to my left, her cheeks hollow, shook her head so gently it was barely a movement. "No home left," she whispered in halting English, and the words struck me harder than the officer's command. The silence spread heavy and unyielding. I felt it pressing against my chest. I wanted to lift my eyes to catch the faces of the others, but fear held me still. What if they saw the dread in me too? What if they knew that in that instant, freedom was not the gift we had prayed for, but a sentence to step into ruins we could not bear to face? One girl, no more than 20, wrapped her arms tight around herself as if to hold in the sob that threatened to escape. The officer, bewildered, repeated the line again, his voice firmer this time, as though insisting could make it true. "You can go home." But the second time sounded thinner, less certain, as if even he felt the weight of our silence. I thought of the letters I had hidden beneath my mattress pages, smudged with ink and tears. My mother's hand trembling across the paper, telling me she boiled nettles for soup and patched holes in the cellar roof with rags. She had written that my brother was missing somewhere in Russia, and that she slept with her coat pulled over her head against the cold. When I closed my eyes, I could see her words, like pictures: a kitchen with no bread, a street where buildings stood only as skeletons, a sky empty of safety. Could I call that place home? Could I walk back into that world and still call it living? The officer's gaze swept over us, waiting for something: cheers, movement, even defiance. What he saw instead must have unsettled him. Women with lips, pressed tight hands, trembling eyes, clouded with something heavier than joy. He shifted in his boots, dust clinging to the cuffs of his trousers, his authority reduced to words that no one wanted to accept. Freedom had been his weapon, and yet it lay useless in the dust. One of the older women finally spoke, her German thick on her tongue, as she tried to shape it into English. "Home broken. Nothing." The sound of it cracked something open inside me, because I knew she was right. I remembered the journey across the Atlantic. The troop ship painted gray, the waves hammering against its hull. We had been certain we were heading toward cruelty, toward punishment, worse than death. Propaganda had warned us of brutality, of hunger, of cages, where no mercy lived. We had clung to each other in terror, counting the days with fear sharp in our throats. Yet here in these camps, there had been food strange at times, peanut butter thick and clinging to the roof of the mouth, bread soft and white meat, that tasted of a life we had forgotten. There had been shoes, real shoes, not patched rags. There had been soap that left the skin clean for the first time in years. Now to step outside the wire meant leaving all of that behind for the hunger my mother wrote of, for the cold that lived in the ruins of my hometown. I felt the contradiction coil inside me, until I could hardly breathe. How could captivity feel safer than freedom? How could I want the fences to hold me rather than open? Yet the truth settled heavy as stone. Here I was guarded, but here I was fed. Here I slept in a bed with a roof above me, even if the roof was rough wood and rattled in the wind. Out there beyond the ocean, home had collapsed into ash. The word itself no longer matched the place. Home was once laughter at a table, bread pulled from an oven, my brother's footsteps in the hall. Now it was rubble, absence, and fear. The officer dismissed us at last, his shoulders tight with confusion, and we shuffled back to the barracks in silence. No one rushed, no one smiled. No one dared to look beyond the wire. Inside, some women sat with their faces buried in their hands. Others took out the letters they had folded and unfolded so many times the creases had nearly torn. I lay on my bunk, staring at the beams above me, the words still echoing in my ears. You can go home. Each repetition only deepened the hollow in my chest. That night the lights stayed on longer than usual. Whispers drifted from bunk to bunk. Voices waited with fear. What will we find there? Someone asked, in the darkness. Another answered, nothing but ghosts. I pressed my palms against my face, trying to block out their words, but they had already taken root inside me. The thought of stepping onto a train eastward filled me with more dread than the first day I saw barbed wire. Captivity had been my fear once, but now it felt like the only ground still solid beneath my feet. As the storm rolled across the prairie, outside rain drumming against the roof, I listened to the wind tear at the shutters, and thought of my mother's cellar, of her sleeping beneath holes in the roof of her, waiting for me in a place that no longer existed. I whispered to myself so quietly no one could hear, better a prisoner here than free in ruins. The words tasted bitter, but they were true. And in that bitter truth began the story none of us had expected, the story of prisoners who feared the very freedom they had once prayed for. The silence of that day clung to me for weeks, but life inside the wire did not stop. Each morning the bell rang sharp against the prairie air, and we rose from our bunks stiff with sleep and lined up as the guards directed. The days had their rhythm, and though we called it captivity, the rhythm itself became a kind of survival. I remember the smell of boiled coffee drifting from the guardhouse, the shuffle of our shoes on gravel, the way the sun always seemed too wide over the endless fields. It was not freedom, but it was order, and after years of chaos and fear, order had its own kind of mercy. Meals were the first shock I never overcame. They placed trays before us, with bread so white it seemed unnatural, soft to the touch, not the coarse rye we had torn into back home when there was still bread at all. Meat appeared more often than I dared believe. Sometimes beef, sometimes chicken, sometimes sausage, that left the taste of fat in my mouth. And then there was peanut butter, thick and sticky, strange to us, but so rich that I ate it by the spoonful, ashamed of my own hunger. I thought of my mother boiling nettles for soup, of neighbors trading heirlooms for potatoes, and I felt the shame grow heavier. Behind barbed wire, I was nourished more than I ever had been in my own kitchen. We were issued clothes rough, but clean, and sometimes new shoes. I will never forget the day they gave me a pair that fit perfectly. My last shoes at home had split at the seams, patched with scraps of leather until they could no longer hold. Here in a camp meant for prisoners, I stepped into boots that carried me without pain. I wanted to cry, not from gratitude, but from the cruel irony of it. To receive comfort as a captive felt like a betrayal of the world I had once belonged to. There was soap too, and hot water when the boilers worked. To stand in a shower and let the dirt run from my hair felt almost sinful. I remembered the last time I had bathed freely in Germany, years before, when water was rationed and soap was a luxury sold only on black markets. My sister had written to me that she had not bathed in months, that her skin itched constantly, that the water in the well near her village was too foul to use. I held the bar of soap in my hand and thought of her letter, the ink blurred by her tears, and I could not decide if I wanted to laugh or collapse in grief. Work filled our days. In Iowa, some of us were sent to the fields to bend over corn rows or pull sugar beets from the earth. Under the sun, our dresses clung to our backs, with sweat our hands raw from labor. Yet even there the abundance was undeniable. Cornfields stretched farther than the eye could see, endless green against the horizon. We joked in broken English that America had more corn than soldiers. Sometimes the guards laughed with us, shaking their heads at our clumsy words. For a moment, the work felt less like punishment and more like proof that life still carried on somewhere untouched by the ruins across the ocean. In Kansas, women labored in camp kitchens, peeling mountains of potatoes until the starch coated our fingers. The smell of food lingered thick in the humid air, and though we were weary, there was always something to eat, always enough to keep hunger at bay. I thought of my cousin in Dresden who wrote that she stood in a line for hours for a few ounces of flour that children fainted in schools from hunger. I could not reconcile her suffering with the meals laid before me each day. Captivity was supposed to mean deprivation. Instead, I carried guilt with every bite. At night, music drifted from the barracks. An accordion one woman had smuggled across the ocean filled the air with songs from home. We sang softly, sometimes hymns, sometimes folk tunes. The sound lifted above the prairie, blending with the chirp of insects and the distant howl of wind. For a moment, the fences seemed to fade, and we were simply women again. Not prisoners, not enemies, just voices holding on to memory. I lay on my bunk, listening, my chest tight with longing, knowing that in Hamburg or Cologne, such songs were drowned out by the crack of collapsing walls and the silence of hunger. The guards noticed, though they said little. I caught one young soldier watching us with a look I could not name. He seemed less like a captor than a boy wondering how we were different from his sister back home. Sometimes they softened. An apple passed quietly into a hand during field work. A smile exchanged without words. Small mercies, but they rooted in me, unsettling everything I had been told to believe. Weren't these men supposed to hate us, to strip us of dignity? Instead, they gave me food, shoes, soap. It was not kindness, perhaps only duty, but it felt like more than I expected. Still, the irony cut deep. I was a prisoner, yet my stomach was full. I wore shoes that did not fall apart. I washed with soap when my family at home could not. I sang to the rhythm of an accordion while they huddled in cellars, listening for the next bomb. Every comfort inside these fences threw into sharper relief the devastation outside them. It was not America I loved, nor the barbed wire that surrounded me. It was survival, plain and undeniable. And survival, I learned, could sometimes wear the mask of captivity. Each day I felt the paradox grow. Freedom meant hunger, rubble, wandering streets without roofs. Captivity meant order, food, even a fragile sense of dignity. I wanted to despise the comfort, to resist it, but when the bread was soft and warm, when the water ran clean, when laughter broke the silence of the fields, I could not. I wondered if this was what broke so many of us. Not the fences, but the knowledge that they had come to feel safer than the ruins waiting across the sea. At night, when I lay awake listening to the breathing of the women around me, I felt both shame and relief. Shame that I had more in captivity than my family had in freedom, relief that I would not starve tomorrow. I carried both feelings like stones in my chest, heavy and unmovable. That was the life of the camp, the life of a prisoner who was no longer certain what freedom meant or where home truly was. At first, the guards were nothing more than silhouettes and uniform figures that moved along the fences, with rifles slung over their shoulders, eyes sharp and distant. We kept our heads low when they passed, our bodies tense, every step heavy with the memory of warnings we had heard back home. We had been told that Americans were brutes, destroyers without mercy. In those first weeks I believed it, or at least I forced myself to. Better to cling to suspicion than risk the hurt of disappointment. When one of them barked orders, I flinched. When they stood near, I kept my distance. I told myself they were enemies, and it was safer that way. Yet time, relentless as it was, began to erode those walls. The days stretched long, filled with routine that blurred the lines between us. They watched us work, and we watched them in return. Their faces were not so different from ours, young, tired, carrying shadows in their eyes. I remember one morning in the fields, the sun already pressing down, when my stomach twisted with hunger even after breakfast. A guard no older than 20 walked past with an apple in his hand. He paused, glanced around, and then, as if embarrassed by his own impulse, placed it quietly in my palm. I stared at the fruit, red and gleaming against the dirt of my fingers, and for the first time, I felt the certainty crack. Enemies do not give each other apples. At night, when the accordion began to play in the barracks, we would sing softly, our voices low but carrying. Sometimes the guards stopped their patrols, lingering in the shadows just beyond the light. I could feel their presence still and listening as the melodies drifted across the camp. One of them hummed, once barely audible, and when we heard it, we fell silent, startled. But he only smiled, a flicker of something human across the distance, before resuming his walk. In that small moment, I realized the music had crossed the wire more easily than we ever could. I began to notice other things. The way one guard looked at us with weariness, as though the burden of watching women weighed heavier than standing on a battlefield. The way another adjusted his rifle, strap awkwardly, his movements clumsy, more like a boy than a soldier. Once, when a letter arrived for me, my hands trembled too much to open it. The young man who handed it over did not mock me, did not rush me. He simply waited, his expression softer than I expected, and in his eyes I thought I saw recognition, the kind that comes from knowing what it feels like to dread the words written inside. Still, there were boundaries we could not cross. They were guards, we were prisoners. Orders shaped every interaction. But beneath those boundaries, something fragile grew. I caught them watching us not with suspicion, but with curiosity, perhaps even pity. One sergeant lingered outside our barracks as the music played, and later, I heard him whisper to another, "They look no older than my sister." That sentence stayed with me, echoing in my mind. To him, I was not enemy, not prisoner, but a mirror of someone he loved. The paradox deepened with each passing day. I wanted to despise them, to hold on to the image of the enemy. It was easier to survive with walls inside the heart. But when the young soldier pressed an apple into my hand, when I heard the hum of a guard blending with our songs, when I saw them hesitate, as if torn between duty and compassion, the walls weakened. I wondered what they thought when they looked at us. Did they imagine their sisters, their daughters, their neighbors? Did they see us as women first and prisoners second? Once in the field, I lifted my head and caught the gaze of a guard across Kos. The rows of corn. He looked away quickly, but not before I saw the flicker of something I could not name. It was not hatred, not disdain, but something gentler, something human. For a moment I forgot the rifles, forgot the barbed wire, forgot the war that had carried us here. For a moment I simply saw another soul as weary and uncertain as my own. And yet each small mercy carried its own weight of sorrow. The apple tasted of peace, but also of shame, for my mother could not taste such sweetness. The music that softened their hearts reminded me of how silent my homeland had grown. The recognition in their eyes warmed me, but it also made me ache, knowing that when they thought of sisters and daughters, I thought of mine, lost to the war. Our humanity bound us, but it also sharpened the grief of what we had lost. Over time, the tension that had once filled the camp softened. There were still moments of fear, of harsh orders, of the sharp reminder that we were captives. But beneath it all, an understanding began to take root. We were enemies by uniform, but human by nature. And in the quiet hours when the prairie wind carried our songs into the night, I realized that the barbed wire could not keep the human heart from recognizing itself in the other. It was a truth both comforting and cruel, for it reminded me that even in captivity, even under the gaze of a guard, I was not entirely alone. The small cracks of humanity we found with the guards could never erase the shadows that grew heavier each time the mail arrived. Letters were both blessing and curse. We clung to them with trembling hands, waiting for our names to be called, our hearts pounding as though the folded papers carried our entire future. And in a way, they did. I remember the first one I received after weeks of silence. My mother's familiar script trembled across the page, the ink faint in places where the pen had scraped against thin paper. She wrote that Hamburg was no longer a city, only ruins. She slept in the cellar because the roof had holes. My brother had not been heard from in months, last seen somewhere in Russia. She told me she boiled nettles and potato peels for soup, that sometimes even those were scarce. I pressed the paper to my chest and felt my throat close. The barracks swirled around me, but all I could see were the empty streets she described. Others read their letters aloud, their voices breaking. A woman 2 bunks over spoke of Cologne, how it no longer resembled a city, but looked instead like a lunar landscape, nothing but chimneys and broken walls. She said her sister's children had fainted at school from hunger. Another girl whispered that her village had been consumed by the Soviet advance, her family scattered or gone. The words filled the air, like ash covering us, until we could hardly breathe. We listened in silence, and when the letters were folded away, none of us could sleep. I thought of the guards, who sometimes offered apples or paused to listen to our songs. They believed they were announcing good news when they said, "You can go home." But each line we read told us otherwise. Home was no longer roofs and hearths and bread pulled fresh from ovens. Home had collapsed into rubble, into hunger, into absence. The word itself carried a wound. To be free meant to walk back into emptiness, to search for doors that no longer stood, to call for family who would never answer. One night, I unfolded my mother's letter again, under the dim barracks light. I traced the words with my finger, as though touching them could bring me closer to her. She wrote, "If you return, I do not know where you will sleep." That sentence haunted me more than any barbed wire fence. Here in captivity, I had a bed rough as it was, and food that filled my stomach. There, beyond the ocean, freedom meant wandering like a ghost through ruins. I lay awake with the letter on my chest, staring at the wooden beams above me, and wondered how freedom could feel more terrifying than chains. Sometimes, the women compared memories of home, not the homes that now stood broken, but the ones that lived only in our minds. They spoke of apple trees in blossom, of kitchens, warm with the smell of bread, of brothers who laughed too loud at the supper table. The memories shimmered like fragile glass, beautiful and unbearable. We clung to them because they were all we had. Yet they cut us too, because we knew the real places no longer existed. The Germany we remembered was gone, and what remained was a wasteland we could hardly bear to picture. The guards could not understand. To them, the war was over. They spoke of going home, to farms, to wives, to families waiting in safety. They did not see that for us home was nothing but hollow ground. Some tried to reassure us, saying Germany would rise again, that rebuilding was possible. Their voices carried sincerity, but sincerity could not fill an empty stomach or raise a roof from ash. We nodded politely, but inside we carried the certainty that their vision of home was a dream that belonged to someone else. I often caught myself staring westward toward the horizon, imagining the ocean that separated me from the ruins. The prairie stretched wide and indifferent, yet it felt solid beneath my feet. I feared the moment when I would be forced to step onto a train, then a ship, to cross back into the nightmare my mother's letters described. Captivity had become the fragile line that kept me from exile. I whispered it to myself at night, the truth I could not say aloud: better a prisoner here than free in nothingness. The irony grew sharper with each passing day. The guards believed the open gates would mean joy. But for us, the gates opened onto rubble, hunger, and silence. The thought pressed on me until I felt hollow inside, as though I were already wandering through those broken streets. My body sat behind the wire, my stomach filled with American bread, but my mind walked barefoot through ruins, carrying letters that smelled of ash. That was the cruelest paradox of all, that the chains I once feared now felt like the last protection I could trust. The letters from home weighed on us like stones, and as the months passed, the fear of what waited beyond the ocean grew sharper than the fences around us. Whispers began to fill the barracks at night, hushed voices asking the same desperate question: what if we didn't leave? It seemed unthinkable at first. Prisoners were meant to long for release, not resist it. And yet as the date of repatriation crept closer, more of us began to wonder if captivity was the safer choice. Some women put those whispers onto paper. I saw them scribbling on scraps, their handwriting shaky, as if ashamed of the plea they were making. They wrote petitions to the officers, asking to stay on, as workers offering to clean kitchens, scrub floors, or tend gardens, if only they could remain behind the wire. One woman begged for a contract as a nurse, pointing out her training in Germany. Another proposed she could work as a maid for American families. The petitions were clumsy, filled with broken English, but they carried a truth we could no longer deny. Freedom had become a threat, captivity a shield. I remember one night when the air in the barracks was heavy with thunder. A young woman named Lotte sat up on her bunk, her face pale in the lamplight. "Better to stay a prisoner than to be free in ruins," she said, her voice trembling but firm. The words struck us silent. They carried what all of us felt, but had not dared to say aloud. In Germany there was hunger, emptiness, fear of soldiers in the night. Here at least there was bread, a bed, and the strange mercy of order. Her sentence echoed long after the storm passed, and I knew it would follow me to the day I was forced onto a train. The fear was not only of hunger. Rumors spread of what awaited in the Soviet zone, women dragged from cellars, villages emptied, overnight punishments handed out without mercy. Even those destined for British or American sectors dreaded the journey. Temporary camps there were said to be crowded and short of food. We compared it with what we had here: 3 meals a day, soap music at night. The contrast was unbearable. It was not love for our captors that drove our pleas, but survival. Some grew desperate. A few asked if marriage might be possible if they could stay by binding their lives to guards or civilians. Regulations made such dreams impossible, but the fact that women spoke them aloud showed how far fear had carried us. I overheard a girl no older than 20 telling a guard that she would rather scrub floors in Texas for the rest of her life than risk one night in the Soviet zone. He looked at her in shock, unable to answer. The barbed wire he walked beside had turned in her eyes into protection. The officers who received our petitions seemed bewildered. They expected us to rush toward release, to embrace the chance to return. Instead, they found themselves reading notes, scrawled in broken English, each one carrying the same plea: "Please let us stay." Some guards admitted in letters home that the sight haunted them. One young soldier wrote, "They are afraid of freedom. They say there is nothing left there, nothing to eat, nothing to live for." He confessed he never imagined the enemy would beg to remain his prisoner. For me, the thought of stepping off a ship into Bremerhaven filled me with dread so deep I could hardly breathe. My mother's words echoed in my head: "If you return, I do not know where you will sleep." I pictured myself wandering through streets of rubble, clutching her letter, searching for a roof that no longer existed. Inside the camp I had food, shoes, even soap. Outside, freedom offered only hunger and ghosts. The petitions were never granted. Rules were rules, and the Geneva Convention demanded repatriation. But the act of writing them, of begging for chains, revealed how broken our world had become. Each plea was not a denial of Germany, but a desperate attempt to cling to life where it still seemed possible. In the end, the irony was unbearable, that in the heart of America, the land painted as monstrous in propaganda, we had found the only refuge we trusted. And so with trembling hands we begged to remain prisoners, knowing full well what waited if those gates opened and we were forced to go home. The petitions were read, folded, and set aside. No matter how desperate, they could not stop what had already been decided. Orders came down with the cold precision of bureaucracy, and soon the camps buzzed with uneasy preparation. We were told to pack what little we owned: scarves knitted in captivity, notebooks filled with songs and fears, photographs worn soft at the edges. The air grew heavier with each passing day, the unspoken dread settling like dust on our skin. I could feel it in the way women walked slower to roll call, in the way they lingered by the fences, as if trying to memorize every strand of barbed wire as though it might hold them safe one last time. Then the day came. The trains waited on the tracks, iron wheels gleaming in the prairie. Sunday. Their whistles cut through the camp like a blade, shrill and final. We lined up our belongings, clutched to our chests, and marched toward the gates. I thought I would feel relief, perhaps even joy, but all I felt was a hollowness that threatened to swallow me whole. The wire that had once been my prison now looked like a lifeline being torn away. As we stepped through the gates, I felt stripped, not of chains, but of the fragile safety I had built inside them. The officers stood, stiff their uniforms, dusty from long service, their expressions unsettled. They had expected cheers, maybe even gratitude, but instead they watched women shuffle forward with tears streaking their faces, some whispering prayers, others silent as stone. I caught sight of one lieutenant pressing his lips together, as if the weight of our sorrow pressed on him too. He looked away quickly, but I saw the confusion in his eyes. He had done his duty, but even he seemed to realize that in fulfilling it he was sending us into exile rather than homecoming. On the train, the air was thick with grief. Women pressed their faces against the glass, watching the camp recede into the distance. The barracks, the fences, even the guard towers all faded like a strange kind of sanctuary being stolen from us. I rested my forehead against the cold window pane, my breath fogging the glass, and whispered to myself the words Lotte had spoken. Better to stay a prisoner than to be free in ruins. The irony stung so deeply it felt like a wound. The whistle blew again, long and mournful, as if mocking our sorrow. Outside, the American soldiers stood, watching their rifles slung but unused. Some shifted uncomfortably, their eyes lowered. I wondered what they thought as they saw us leave, not with joy but with dread. Did they understand that the barbed wire had protected us more than it had confined us? Did they realize that they were sending us not into freedom but into hunger, rubble, and silence? One young guard, barely 19 later, wrote in a letter I overheard read aloud, "I never thought I'd see prisoners cry, because they had to go free." His words captured the heart of it. The world beyond the fence had become unrecognizable, and yet we were pushed toward it helpless, against the tide of orders and trains. As the camp disappeared from view, I closed my eyes and tried to fix it in memory. The clang of the morning bell, the smell of bread, the sound of music rising in the night. It had not been home, but it had been survival. And as the wheels carried us farther east, the ache inside me grew sharper. We were no longer prisoners, yet I felt more captive than ever, bound not by wire, but by the ruins waiting on the other side of the sea. Years later, after the trains and ships had carried us back across the ocean, the memories of the camps lingered like shadows that would not fade. Some of us tried to rebuild in Germany, piecing together lives from rubble and silence. Streets where we had once played as children were gone, reduced to broken stone and empty shells. Families were scattered graves unmarked. And yet, even as we stitched our lives back together, the memory of captivity returned in unexpected ways. We remembered the shame of being guarded, of lining up under watchful eyes, but also the strange relief of knowing we would eat, of hearing music at night, of feeling for the first time in years clean and clothed. A handful of women found their way back to America, no longer as prisoners, but as immigrants, seeking the land where survival had surprised them. They spoke of arriving on new shores, of walking streets they had once imagined only through barbed wire. For them, America was not the land of their captors, but the place where life had been possible when home had turned to ash. For those who remained in Germany, the camps lived on in memory, as both humiliation and sanctuary. They carried the paradox quietly, rarely spoken, but deeply felt. Captivity had stripped them of freedom, yet had given back fragments of dignity their homeland could not. It was a contradiction that shaped their lives, one that could never be resolved. I often think of it now, how freedom was not the absence of fences, but the presence of safety, food, and hope. We had been told, "You can go home," but home no longer existed. The truest home we had known in those years was inside the very fences that were meant to confine us. That is the cruelest lesson of it all, that sometimes freedom is nothing but an empty promise, and prison, for all its shame, can be the last fragile refuge of survival, and the only place left where a human being remembers what it means to live. In the end, the story of those women lingers as a quiet wound in history. Freedom, spoken as a promise, had carried them into hunger and ruins, while captivity, meant as punishment, had given them food, shelter, and fleeting dignity. Their memories remind us that liberty is not simply the opening of gates, but the presence of safety and hope. Behind the wire, they had found survival. Beyond it, only emptiness. The paradox remains: sometimes chains protect more than they confine, and true freedom is measured not by borders, but by the fragile chance to live as human beings.